Have you ever wondered why some people can pass through major upheavals in life and still maintain a strange sense of calm, while others are swept away by the smallest events? Why can the same criticism keep one person awake for nights, while another simply smiles and keeps walking? And why is it that the more mature people become, the more deeply they understand themselves, the less they seem to be disturbed by life? In a world where everything constantly demands our attention, from other people's opinions, social expectations, invisible competitions, to the fear of being left behind, most people live as if everything were a matter of survival. A rejection can become a crisis. A failure can become a definition of the self. Even a small change can shake an entire inner world. But Carl Jung saw another possibility. He realized that much of human suffering does not come from life itself, but from the way the ego continuously clings to everything, as if its very existence depended on it. In today's video, we will explore one of the most misunderstood yet liberating ideas in Jungian psychology. Act as if nothing matters. Not living with indifference, not denying emotions, not abandoning what is meaningful. Rather, it is the gradual journey of untangling the invisible threads that bind the ego to fear, to control, to roles, and to the countless stories the mind endlessly tells about life. If you have ever felt that you think too much, worry too much, react too much, or carry burdens that sometimes even you do not understand why you have carried for so long, then perhaps this journey is for you. Are you ready to step into it? Number 1. What causes the greatest suffering is not reality itself, but the meaning people attach to it. There is something very strange about human life that most of us rarely notice. Many of the things that cause us suffering do not actually come from what happened, but from what we believe those things mean. An event enters life and is initially just an event. A statement is initially just a statement. Even a silence is sometimes simply a silence. Yet almost immediately, the mind begins doing what it has done ever since human beings learned how to think. It interprets. Someone does not reply to a message. The objective reality at that moment is simply that a message has not yet received a response. But only minutes later, an entirely new story has already begun forming in the mind. Maybe they no longer care. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they are trying to avoid me. Maybe I am not important enough to deserve a reply. What is remarkable is that none of those things have actually happened in reality. They exist only within the mind's process of interpretation. Yet the paradox is that people often react to that story as though it were absolute truth, even though what they are reacting to is not the original event, but the meaning added onto it afterward. Carl Jung spent much of his life exploring how the mind creates psychological reality. He realized that human beings do not live directly in the objective world as much as they believe they do. Instead, they live in a world of symbols, assumptions, conclusions, and countless meanings that they continuously attach to their experiences. This does not mean reality does not exist. It simply means that between reality and human experience, there is always an invisible veil woven from interpretation. That is also where the phrase, "act as if nothing matters," is most often misunderstood. Many people hear it and assume it encourages indifference, coldness, or a denial of life's value. But perhaps its deeper meaning lies somewhere entirely different. Perhaps it is inviting people to try living as though the stories the mind constantly adds to every event no longer hold absolute authority. It is not that everything is meaningless. It is that not every meaning created by the mind deserves to be trusted. Imagine a man walking through a forest late in the afternoon. In the distance, among the trees and the lengthening shadows, he sees a dark figure standing silently. Within a few seconds, the mind immediately begins working. It could be a dangerous animal. It could be someone watching him. Something terrible may be about to happen. But as he gets closer, he realizes it is only an old tree stump that had fallen over long ago. What is interesting is that the anxiety he felt beforehand was completely real in his experience, even though the cause of it never actually existed. The source of suffering was not the tree stump. The source of suffering was the meaning attached to the tree stump. Human psychological life functions in much the same way. One viewer of the channel once shared that she spent nearly 3 weeks in a state of tension because of a brief meeting with her supervisor. After the meeting, her manager said that he wanted to speak with her privately the following week. It was only a simple sentence, yet for days afterward, her mind would not stop interpreting. Maybe I am about to receive a poor evaluation. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe this job is about to end. She began reviewing every email she had sent, every conversation that had taken place, and every small detail she had never paid attention to before. Yet, when the meeting finally happened a week later, her manager simply wanted to discuss giving her greater responsibility on a new project. What exhausted her for days was not the meeting itself, but the dozens of stories her mind quietly created around it. Perhaps this is one of the strangest capacities of human consciousness. We do not merely experience life. We continuously comment on life while we are experiencing it. Every event is labeled, every moment is categorized, and everything that happens is pulled into a vast network of meaning that the mind tirelessly tries to construct. But the problem is that the mind cannot tolerate emptiness. It does not like not knowing. It does not like things that have no clear conclusion. So rather than waiting for reality to reveal itself, it often rushes to finish the story on reality's behalf. Carl Jung once wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." This statement is often understood as a reminder about healing, but on a deeper level, it reflects something very important about psychological life. Human beings often rush toward conclusions because accepting that they do not yet know what is truly happening is far more uncomfortable. We like immediate explanations. We like naming everything. We like finishing the story as quickly as possible because, for the mind, a rushed answer is often more comfortable than sitting quietly in uncertainty. Perhaps that is also why so much suffering in life does not arise at the moment an event occurs, but during the period afterward, when the mind begins adding details, motives, predictions, and meanings. A careless remark becomes an insult. A small distance becomes a sign of collapse. An ordinary change becomes an omen of something much greater. What is worth reflecting on is that reality is often far simpler than what the mind imagines. Yet because human beings do not experience reality directly, but through the lens of interpretation, they often react to meanings rather than to events themselves. Maturity is not learning how to become wiser in order to control everything that happens in life, nor is it trying to find the perfect explanation for everything that appears along the journey. Maturity begins at the moment a person realizes that not every thought appearing in the mind is true, not every conclusion is trustworthy, and not every meaning created by the mind accurately reflects reality. And perhaps that is the deepest layer of meaning behind "act as if nothing matters." Try living as though the mind's first interpretations are not always correct. Try living as though there is no need to immediately turn every event into a story about yourself. Try remaining with what is happening a little longer before assigning it a final meaning. Because sometimes what causes the greatest suffering has never been life itself, but the stories people unconsciously tell themselves about life. Number 2. Life becomes lighter when you stop making yourself the center of everything. But if much of suffering arises when people unconsciously assign meanings to the events of life, then perhaps an even deeper layer of the problem lies in the fact that people do not merely interpret the world. They also unconsciously place themselves at the center of nearly everything the world is doing. There is a very common psychological tendency that almost everyone experiences at some point in life, yet rarely notices operating within them. It is the feeling that somehow everything is related to oneself. If someone becomes distant, we wonder what we did wrong. If someone changes, we immediately assume the cause must somehow involve us. And if a relationship ends, if someone leaves, if a person no longer behaves the way they once did, the mind almost instantly begins pulling all those events toward a single center, the self. Interestingly, this tendency usually does not arise from selfishness in the ordinary sense. Most people who carry this tendency are not arrogant individuals or people who constantly seek to be the center of attention. On the contrary, they are often highly sensitive, deeply caring, and always trying to maintain harmony in relationships. Yet because of this, they unconsciously carry the assumption that any change appearing in the surrounding world must somehow be connected to them. Carl Jung observed that the ego possesses a powerful need to place itself at the center of the story. The ego wants to be the main character in every event, because doing so allows it to maintain the feeling that it understands what is happening and that it still occupies an important position within the structure of the world. But life rarely functions that way. Perhaps one of the most difficult truths of maturity is realizing that most of what other people do has far less to do with us than we once imagined. A friend who becomes distant may be struggling with problems we know nothing about. A colleague who behaves differently may be experiencing pressures within their family life. Someone who was once enthusiastic and suddenly becomes silent may be passing through an inner transformation they themselves do not yet fully understand. Yet because human beings view the world from their own position, the first reaction is often not curiosity about the other person's story, but a question about what it says about us. There is a beautiful story in the Bible about the prophet Elijah. After the great events he endured, there came a moment when Elijah felt completely alone. He believed everything around him was falling apart, that all of history seemed to revolve around the crisis he was experiencing. Yet when he encountered God on Mount Horeb, he realized something unexpected. The world was continuing to move in ways far greater than his personal story. There were things happening that he could not see. There were other people living, struggling, and walking their own journeys. Reality turned out to be far larger than the frame his mind had built around himself. That is also the lesson life quietly teaches every person at some point. We often live as though we stand at the center of a vast stage, when in reality life may resemble a night sky more than anything else. Each person is like a star moving along their own orbit, carrying their own worries, hopes, losses, questions, and inner battles. Those orbits sometimes intersect for a period of time and then separate again. But the fact that a star changes direction does not necessarily mean it is reacting to us. Sometimes it is simply continuing its own journey. That is why so much suffering begins to dissolve when people stop trying to view themselves as the center of every disturbance. Not because life becomes easier, but because they begin seeing a larger picture. Jung once wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." This statement is often presented as an invitation toward introspection, but on a deeper level, it also reflects a crucial shift in the process of maturity. When guided by the ego, people continuously look outward for explanations for every disturbance occurring around them. They ask what it says about them, how it affects them, and what it reflects about their value. But the more mature they become, the more they begin looking at their own reactions rather than merely at the event itself. And from there, a new question slowly emerges. What is actually happening beyond the story my ego is telling? A very particular kind of relief appears when people first realize that not every cold response is rejection, not every distance is denial, and not every change is a reaction to them. Sometimes other people are simply living their own lives. Sometimes they are growing in a different direction. Sometimes they are struggling with things that have absolutely nothing to do with us. This is also where the phrase, "act as if nothing matters," seems to reveal another layer of meaning. Perhaps it is not asking people to become indifferent to the world or to turn away from what is happening around them. Instead, it is gently inviting us to live as though not everything revolves around ourselves. Try entering a room without immediately wondering what everyone thinks about you. Try witnessing someone's change without instantly turning it into a story about your own worth. And try allowing life to move along its own orbit without requiring it to revolve around the ego at the center. Because there is a beautiful paradox in the journey of maturity. When people stop trying to become the center of every story, they do not disappear from life. On the contrary, it is then that they can finally participate in life more fully, seeing other people more clearly, seeing the world more broadly, and gradually experiencing a profound kind of freedom that the ego had never known before. Perhaps that is the moment when an invisible burden finally begins to be set down, because people ultimately realize that life was never created to revolve around them. And strangely enough, it is precisely when they stop standing at the center of everything that they feel lighter than ever before. Number 3. Persona, the mask that makes people forget who they are. But if human beings can learn to stop seeing themselves as the center of every story, would they still recognize who is standing behind all the roles they have carried for so many years? There is something very special in psychological life that Carl Jung observed in almost everyone. We do not merely live our lives, but also live through the characters we have unconsciously become. Over time, each person learns to present a certain face to the world. Some become the strong one, some become the calm one, some become the understanding one, and some become the person who always has an answer for every problem. At first, These are merely adaptations that help people move more easily through life, but very slowly and very quietly. What was once only a role begins to be regarded as their true nature. Jung called this layer of identity the persona, the psychological mask that people carry with them as they enter social life. The persona itself is not the problem, because in reality, it is a completely natural part of the process of existing and interacting with the world. We all need certain roles in order to communicate, work, build relationships, and live alongside others. The difficulty begins, however, when a person wears that mask for so long that they gradually forget it was only a role they were playing rather than the entirety of who they truly are. This process rarely happens in a single day. More often it forms over many years, when someone who must always be strong for their family gradually begins to believe they are not allowed to be vulnerable. When someone who is always a source of support for others gradually believes they are not allowed to be tired. Or when someone who always appears wise and understanding begins to think they no longer have the right to feel confused. Then, at some point, they are no longer acting the role. They begin living entirely inside it. A woman named Anna, whom I met during a Jungian therapy session, once shared an experience like this. For nearly 20 years, she had been known by everyone as an exceptionally calm person. No matter what happened, she always maintained an astonishing composure. Friends came to her in times of crisis, colleagues sought her advice, and even within her family, Anna was always the person everyone relied on whenever difficulties arose. Over time, that image became so familiar that she herself came to believe it was who she truly was. Yet then, a very strange period began to emerge. No major event occurred, and there was no obvious crisis, but Anna started feeling exhausted in a way she could not explain. Conversations that had once felt natural gradually became draining. Advice that she had previously given with ease now felt heavy, and she constantly felt as though she were carrying out some invisible duty that she no longer even understood why she needed to continue. Only much later did she realize that what was exhausting her was not life itself. What exhausted her was the effort of maintaining the image of someone who was always okay. For many years, she had become so skilled at playing the role of the strong person that she forgot there were still very ordinary parts of herself inside. Parts that could become tired, uncertain, confused, and sometimes simply wanted to rest without carrying anything at all. Interestingly, modern science has also observed a similar phenomenon. In psychology, there is a concept known as self-concept maintenance, the tendency to preserve a consistent image of oneself. The human brain tends to continuously protect the version of ourselves we believe we are, even when our actual experiences have changed. Once someone has identified with a certain identity for too long, they often become uncomfortable whenever aspects of themselves emerge that do not fit that image. This prolonged tension between the real person and the image that must be maintained has become one of the hidden causes of psychological fatigue that many people do not understand the origin of. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The statement sounds simple, but upon closer examination, it contains a profound paradox. If the privilege of an entire lifetime is to become oneself, then it also means that many people are living without truly being themselves. They are the strong one, the good one, the successful one, the reliable one, the rational one, or the understanding one, but none of those things necessarily represent their true essence. Perhaps one of the hardest prisons to recognize is not one built of steel and iron, but one built from the images we have become far too familiar with. What makes that prison especially dangerous is that it does not make people feel imprisoned. On the contrary, it convinces them that it is freedom. It is like an actor who steps onto the stage every day and remains in character for so long that after many years he no longer remembers who he is, once the lights go out. The problem is not that he is acting. The problem is that he has forgotten the boundary between the role and himself. This is also where the phrase, "act as if nothing matters," opens another layer of depth. If most of a person's energy is spent maintaining a particular image of themselves, then relief begins to appear when they stop treating the protection of that image as the most important thing. Not because the mask needs to be destroyed, nor because the roles of life have lost their value, but because at some point people need to remember that they are larger than any role they happen to be carrying. They are greater than the strong person others see, greater than the successful person life once called them, greater than the understanding person everyone still turns to, and greater than all the stories that time has written upon their face. For one of the freest moments a human being can experience is not when they become someone new, but when they finally stop spending so much energy maintaining the character they have carried for such a long portion of life. And in that quietness, for the first time, they can meet the person who has always been present behind the mask they became so familiar with that they almost forgot it had only ever been a role. And what about you? Of all the things we have discussed today, what is the one thing you once held on to most tightly, only to later realize you did not need to carry it for so long? Share your story in the comments below. Perhaps your experience will help someone going through a similar season realize they are not alone. Number 4. Why the fear of being judged is almost always an illusion. If people can gradually realize that they are not always the main character in every story of their lives, then perhaps an even more liberating realization awaits ahead. What if, most of the time, other people are not paying nearly as much attention to us as we think? There is a very common fear that nearly everyone experiences at least once in life, yet what makes it interesting is that it rarely appears in the form of a clear threat or a danger visible to the naked eye. It is not like a storm approaching from the horizon. Instead, it appears much more quietly as the feeling that we are being watched, judged, or noticed far more than we actually are. A person walks into a gathering and suddenly feels self-conscious about the way they are dressed. Someone speaks during a meeting and then spends hours afterward wondering whether their comment caused others to judge them. Or someone posts a photograph on social media and continually returns to check people's reactions. What is interesting is that in most situations like these, what creates tension is not what is actually happening outside, but what they imagine is happening inside other people's minds. One of the most persistent illusions of the human mind is the belief that we occupy far more space in other people's thoughts than we actually do. We often forget that the people around us are busy with their own lives. They are thinking about unfinished work, unpaid bills, conversations from yesterday, plans for next week, or situations unfolding within their families. They are also worrying about how others perceive them, wondering whether they have done something foolish, and living within their own private inner worlds, filled with concerns that we cannot see. But because each person can only experience life from their own perspective, it is easy to feel as though we are standing beneath the spotlight of a great stage, while in reality, everyone around us is standing beneath the spotlight of their own and is just as occupied with their own story as we are with ours. A man named Daniel once shared a fascinating experience. During a professional conference, he accidentally knocked over a glass of water just before the event began. The moment was so embarrassing to him that he became convinced everyone in the room had noticed and would remember it for the rest of the day. Yet something strange happened during the lunch break. While speaking with a few attendees, Daniel discovered that almost nobody remembered the incident. Some had not seen it at all, some noticed briefly and forgot about it within minutes, and some did not even understand what he was referring to when he brought it up himself. Daniel said the most surprising thing was not that people had failed to notice, but that he had spent nearly 3 hours carrying a sense of embarrassment that existed almost entirely within his own mind. Perhaps this is one of those moments many people experience without recognizing its deeper meaning. We often live as though we are standing in the middle of a crowded square with every eye fixed upon us, while in reality, life may be more like a vast train station where everyone is hurrying toward their own train, carrying their own concerns, thoughts, and stories, with barely enough time to focus on someone else's story for as long as we imagine. Carl Jung once wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Although this statement can be interpreted in many ways, it also reminds us of something interesting. People often spend far too much energy on things they believe are extremely important in the eyes of others, while many of those things carry significance only within their own perception. That does not mean others never judge us. It simply means that we often greatly overestimate the extent to which they are thinking about us, as well as the extent to which our actions, words, or small mistakes occupy their minds. Imagine someone standing in front of a building with hundreds of illuminated windows at night. From where he stands, it feels as though the entire building is looking down at him, and the hundreds of glowing windows convince him that countless eyes are directed his way. But reality is completely different. Behind every window, a separate life is unfolding. Someone is cooking dinner, someone is reading a book, someone is arguing, someone is caring for a child, someone is thinking about the future, or worrying about things only they understand. No one is actually standing there observing a stranger on the street for as long as he imagines. Sometimes life operates in much the same way. We see hundreds of windows in the world around us and unconsciously feel as though we are being watched, when in reality, most people are busy living their own lives and rarely devote as much attention to us as we believe. When people realize this, they begin to understand why act as if nothing matters is not a call to become indifferent to life, but rather a reminder that many of the things that make us tense, anxious, or self-conscious have never occupied as much space in other people's minds as we imagine. Try walking into a room without constantly checking how you appear in the eyes of others. Try saying what you want to say without spending hours afterward analyzing every word. And try allowing yourself to make ordinary human mistakes without treating them as events that the entire world will remember. For perhaps one of the greatest freedoms a human being can experience is not getting everyone to stop judging them, but realizing that most of the time, people were never thinking about them nearly as much as they assumed. And when that realization arrives, a vast open space begins to emerge within the mind, where a person no longer has to live beneath the imaginary spotlight of a stage that never truly existed, and for the first time can walk through life more lightly, without carrying the feeling that every eye is turned toward them. Number 5. What you call the self is actually constantly changing. And when people can gradually let go of the obsession with what others are thinking about them, there comes a time when they begin to face an even deeper question. What happens when the very person they have always believed themselves to be is also constantly changing over time? There is a very common assumption that most people carry throughout life. The belief that somewhere inside them there exists a fixed version, a complete self waiting to be found. People often speak about finding themselves, living true to themselves, or becoming their real self, as if the self were an object lying still somewhere and the task of life was simply to discover it. But Carl Jung viewed the human soul in an entirely different way. To him, psychological life was not a motionless structure, but a continuously moving process. Human beings are not something completed once and then preserved forever, but living beings who are always moving, always changing, and always becoming something different from who they were yesterday. What is strange is that most suffering does not arise because of that change, but because people try to resist it. We often feel safe when we can say, "This is who I am, this is what I like, this is what I believe, and this is the path I will walk." But life rarely respects the fixed outlines that the ego wants to draw. Time keeps passing, experiences keep appearing. Things that once seemed very important gradually lose their weight, while things that were never noticed begin to step into the light. Very slowly, very quietly, and almost imperceptibly within each individual day, a person gradually becomes someone else. What is interesting is that this change rarely happens in a way large enough for people to recognize it immediately while it is taking place. Most of the time, it is like watching a child grow day by day. Because the change is so small in each separate moment, people barely notice anything different. Only when they look back across a long enough distance do they suddenly realize that the way they think has changed, the things they value have changed, and even the questions guiding their life have changed. This shows that the self has never been a fixed destination, but rather a journey that is continuously opening new depths within itself. Perhaps one of the most interesting examples of this is the life of Steve Jobs. When he was young, he was obsessed with technology, innovation, and the desire to create products that could change the world. For many years, all of his energy seemed to revolve around building, competing, and creating. But after his cancer diagnosis, the way he looked at life began to change in directions that perhaps even he could not have imagined before. In his famous 2005 Stanford commencement speech, Steve Jobs said that remembering he would die was the most important tool he had ever encountered to help him make the big choices in life. What is worth noticing is not merely the content of that statement, but the fact that the person he had been in his 20s could not have said such things. He was still Steve Jobs, but at the same time, he was no longer the Steve Jobs of before. His values changed, his priorities changed, the important questions changed, and even the way he understood success and the meaning of life also changed. This does not mean the earlier version was wrong, and the later version was right. It simply shows that human beings are a current, not a statue carved once and left standing still forever. There is a beautiful image for imagining this. Picture a river beginning high in the mountains. When it first forms, it is narrow, strong, and full of rushing currents. A few hundred kilometers later, that same river becomes wider, slower, and carries an entirely different shape. If one looked at the two stretches of the river at two different moments, one might think they were not the same. But the paradox is that they have always been the same river. It does not betray itself by changing shape, nor does it lose its essence by changing its flow. It is simply continuing its natural journey in the way every river must. Human psychological life operates in much the same way. Jung once wrote, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning." That is one of his most profound statements, because it reminds us that we cannot live the second half of life according to the same map that was created for the first half. The things that once helped a person grow in their 20s may become limitations in their 40s, and the goals that were once very necessary in one stage may no longer be suitable in the next. But the problem is that the ego deeply dislikes this. It wants consistency, wants everything to be predictable, and wants to continue being the same person it has long been familiar with. Meanwhile, the soul seems to operate according to an entirely different law. It is always seeking expansion, always seeking to explore new territories within itself, and always refusing to be enclosed inside a single definition. That is why so many people feel uneasy when they realize they are no longer the same as before. They look back at things that once excited them and find that they no longer have the same attraction. Look back at beliefs that once felt certain and realize they are beginning to question them. Or look back at the path they once thought they would walk forever and discover that they now want to turn in another direction. But perhaps this is not a sign that they are losing themselves. On the contrary, it may very well be a sign that they are continuing to become themselves. And precisely at this point, the phrase, "act as if nothing matters," appears under an entirely different light. Not as an invitation to abandon life or deny what is important, but as a reminder that we do not need to cling to a fixed image of ourselves as if it were the thing that determines our entire worth. Try allowing yourself to change without immediately seeing it as a betrayal of the person you used to be. Try allowing the beliefs that once helped you grow to complete their role and gently leave when the time has come. And try living as though you do not need to remain the same person for your entire life. Because perhaps one of the deepest expressions of freedom is not finding an unchanging identity to cling to, but the ability to keep walking with the flow of transformation without panicking each time you realize you have become different. And just as a river does not need to apologize for changing shape on its journey toward the open sea, perhaps human beings also do not need to apologize for becoming someone different from who they were yesterday. Number 6. Shadow. The things you hate most are often not as frightening as you think. But if people can gradually accept that the self is not a fixed entity, but something that continuously moves and changes over time, then sooner or later they will also have to face a much more difficult question. What exists within them that they do not want to see? There is something very special about the way human beings build a relationship with themselves. We often think that what we fear most are the dangers coming from the outside world. But Carl Jung realized that many of humanity's deepest fears are not out there at all, but inside, in the psychological regions we have spent many years avoiding, refusing to name, and refusing to admit, also belong to us. Most people carry in their minds a certain image of the person they want to become. Some want to see themselves as good, some want to see themselves as kind, some want to see themselves as selfless, rational, or forgiving. There is nothing wrong with that in itself, but many difficulties begin to appear when anything that does not fit that image is pushed out of view. A small thought appears and is immediately denied. A flash of jealousy arises and is treated as something that should not exist. A selfish moment, a little envy, a desire to control, a bitterness, or even a sense of pleasure at another person's failure may appear for only a few brief seconds, yet it is enough to make people feel uncomfortable with themselves. What is interesting is that what unsettles them is often not those reactions themselves, but the fact that they appear in a place where they believe they are not allowed to appear. Jung called this territory the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it is made of the parts pushed into the darkness of consciousness. They do not disappear, nor do they truly leave. They only leave the place where people are willing to look at them. Perhaps this is why one of the greatest paradoxes of psychological life is that what we hate most in ourselves is often not the most dangerous thing, but the least understood. In world literature, there is a famous story by Robert Louis Stevenson called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is an educated, moral, and socially respected man. He believes that the lower parts within himself must be completely separated in order for him to become the best version of himself. Yet the more he tries to create distance from the parts considered unacceptable, the more powerful they become in the form of Mr. Hyde. What makes that story immortal is not its horror element, but the fact that it reflects an experience many people quietly live with in real life. People often believe that if they do not look at something, it will grow weaker. But sometimes the opposite happens, because being pushed into darkness for too long causes some part of us to become larger in our imagination. Research in cognitive psychology also reveals a very interesting phenomenon known as ironic process theory. When people try not to think about something, the brain must continuously monitor whether that thing is appearing or not, and this very monitoring process unintentionally keeps the avoided object in the mind for longer. Daniel Wegner's famous white bear experiment showed that the more participants tried not to think about the white bear, the more they thought about it. The inner life sometimes operates in a similar way. A person spends years trying to prove they are not weak, yet constantly feels the fear of fragility appearing everywhere. A person tries to prove they are completely generous, yet remains haunted by comparisons with others. Another person tries to prove they are not angry, yet anger still seems to find very different paths through which to appear. Not because those parts are trying to fight against them, but sometimes simply because they have never truly left. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That is perhaps one of his most misunderstood statements, because when people hear about darkness, they often think of something frightening. But what Jung is pointing to is not the frightening nature of darkness, but the frightening nature of not knowing what is in the darkness. Imagine an old attic in a house that has been locked for many years. The owner never goes up there anymore, and over time, imagination begins to fill the empty space left behind. There may be something dangerous up there, something frightening waiting, or perhaps it contains things that are better left unseen. But what is strange is that fear often grows not because of the attic itself, but because of the widening distance between the person and the attic. The shadow is sometimes like that. Many people live for decades with the feeling that something inside them is worth fearing. They do not know exactly what it is. They only know they do not want to come near it. Yet the more they avoid it, the more mysterious, frightening, and seemingly powerful that dark region becomes in their awareness. That is why one of the deepest forms of freedom does not appear when people become more perfect, but when they stop seeing everything pushed into darkness as an enemy. Perhaps what is being suggested here is not a way to eliminate darkness, but a different way of seeing its presence. And here, act as if nothing matters no longer means that everything is meaningless, but rather the ability to live without treating the disowned parts within oneself as a disaster that must be fought at all costs, or as proof that something is wrong with who one is. Try imagining the relief that appears when a person no longer has to spend so much energy constantly running from the things they dislike about themselves. Not because those things disappear, not because they become more beautiful, but simply because at last, they no longer see their existence as evidence that something is wrong with them. Because perhaps what exhausts human beings most has never been the darkness, but the long war against the darkness. And sometimes the freest moment is not when the inner room becomes brighter, but when people finally realize that what they have feared for so long may not be as frightening as they once believed. If by this point you realize that what has exhausted you most is not the darker parts within, but the long battle against them, give this video a like. Perhaps that too is a way of reminding yourself that maturity does not begin when people become more perfect, but when they become brave enough to look at the things they once tried to avoid. Number 7. The story of the man who refused to admit he was jealous. But perhaps what Carl Jung was trying to describe about the shadow becomes much easier to understand when we look at how it operates in the life of an ordinary person, because sometimes what is rejected does not appear in the form of dramatic conflicts, but quietly grows inside reactions so familiar that even we fail to recognize them. There was a man named Michael who was considered a model of maturity in his workplace. He managed a large team, was respected by his colleagues, and always presented himself as rational, calm, and fair. The people around him often remarked that Michael was the kind of person who rarely allowed personal emotions to influence his judgment, and he himself completely believed this. In his mind, jealousy was an emotion belonging to immature people, and he believed he had long since moved beyond such petty reactions. Yet there was something very strange that kept repeating itself over many years, something Michael himself could not explain. Every time a colleague received a promotion, was given a major opportunity, or received special attention from management, he felt an unusual sense of discomfort. The feeling did not erupt into obvious anger, but appeared in far more subtle ways, often taking the form of quiet thoughts that the person had simply been lucky, had received preferential treatment, was perhaps not truly that talented. or merely knew how to present themselves at the right moment. At first, Michael believed he was simply viewing things objectively. Yet, what was strange was that these thoughts appeared with almost everyone who became more successful than him in some area. As time went on, he noticed that he found it easier to see other people's flaws than their achievements. And gradually, he began spending a great deal of energy analyzing why someone did not truly deserve what they had received. What is noteworthy is that throughout all that time, he never once called the emotion by its true name: jealousy. And perhaps that is the most important detail in the entire story. Because within Michael's inner world, his self-image had been built for so long around the idea that he was generous, mature, and above pettiness. Jealousy simply did not fit the person he believed himself to be. Therefore, whenever the feeling appeared, it was almost immediately pushed out of awareness and replaced with other explanations that sounded more reasonable, more acceptable, and less threatening to the image he was trying to maintain of himself. But what is denied does not disappear. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That statement seems to describe exactly what was happening in Michael's life. While he believed he was merely reacting to the unfairness of life, another part of him was quietly shaping how he viewed others, how he judged their success, and even how he felt about his own life, all without his awareness. As the years passed, the discomfort did not become smaller. Instead, it began spreading into other areas of life. It appeared when a friend bought a nicer house, when an acquaintance built a happier family, or when someone his age achieved things he himself had once desired but had not yet attained. Interestingly, Michael's external life remained very stable. He had a good job, a good income, and a position many people wanted. Yet inside, he increasingly felt that the world was unfair, and the more he tried to explain that feeling through external causes, the more exhausted he became. Gradually, Michael became more irritable, slept less, and felt less satisfied with what he already had. What confused him most was that he did not understand why any of this was happening, because according to the way he viewed himself, he had no reason to live in such a state. Perhaps that is one of the strangest characteristics of the shadow. What is rejected does not necessarily appear in the form we expect. It rarely steps forward and introduces itself by name. Instead, it often wears far more sophisticated masks. Fear may appear in the form of control. Hurt may appear as coldness. And sometimes jealousy appears disguised as judgments that seem completely reasonable. Only one day, during an ordinary conversation with an old friend, did Michael hear a question that left him silent for a long time. His friend asked whether what bothered him was truly other people's success, or whether, more deeply, it was the fact that he wanted those things for himself as well. Michael later said that his first reaction was to deny it, explain it away, and prove that the observation was completely wrong. Yet for the first time in many years, he did not continue the familiar argument inside his head. Instead, he simply sat with the question longer than usual, as though for the first time allowing himself to remain with something he had always tried to avoid. And it was in that silence that he realized something more surprising than anything else. What he had spent years fighting was not the unfairness of life, but the admission that he was capable of jealousy, just like any other human being. Strangely enough, The moment it was properly named in his own mind, the feeling no longer seemed to carry the same weight. Not because it disappeared entirely, nor because all problems were instantly solved, but because it no longer had to remain behind a closed door, constantly trying to exert influence from the shadows. That is also what Jung tried to point out throughout many years of studying human psychology. What is pushed into the shadows does not disappear simply because we refuse to look at it. On the contrary, sometimes that very refusal unintentionally gives it more power. Perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect of Michael's story is not that jealousy existed, but that he spent so many years pretending it did not. And perhaps from that point onward, the phrase, "act as if nothing matters," begins to take on another meaning. Not as advice to deny the difficult parts within ourselves, but as the ability to stop treating them as dangerous secrets that must constantly be hidden. Because very often, what makes something heavy is not the thing itself, but the effort sustained over many years to keep it outside the door of consciousness. Number 8. Why human beings always want everything to have meaning. But if some things inside people become heavy only because we spend so many years fighting or denying their existence, then could it be that much other suffering comes from a similar habit, the mind's constant demand that everything in life immediately provide a clear meaning to hold on to? In the way the human mind operates, there seems to be a special relationship with certainty. Not because life is always clear, but because the mind finds it very difficult to remain at peace with unanswered questions. When something happens, a flood of questions almost instantly arises within us. Why did this happen? What does it mean? What is it trying to teach me? What will happen next? Where will all of this ultimately lead? What is interesting is that most of the time these questions do not arise from pure curiosity. They arise because the mind feels uncomfortable with ambiguity and always wants to fill the space of the unknown with some kind of answer. Carl Jung once wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." Perhaps this is one of the statements that most clearly reflects how people experience life, because the mind always wants everything to fall within a realm that can be understood, explained, and connected into a complete story. It wants to turn uncertainty into certainty. It wants to know why things happened the way they did. And above all, it wants to believe that at the end of the road, there is a complete explanation for everything it has experienced. But life rarely operates according to the mind's demands. Some relationships end without ever leaving behind a truly satisfying explanation. Some opportunities appear and disappear, and years later people still do not know whether they were blessings or losses. Some decisions reveal their meaning only after a very long period of time. And there are experiences that people may carry until the end of their lives, without ever being able to fully explain why they happened. Strangely enough, it is precisely this empty space that often becomes an obsession for the mind. There was a woman named Laura who experienced this after the end of a relationship that had lasted nearly 8 years. What exhausted her most was not the separation itself. After many months, she had accepted that it was over. What truly prevented her from moving forward was one single question. Why? She reread old conversations. She analyzed every stage of the relationship. She tried to identify the exact moment everything began to change. There were nights when she lay awake for hours wondering whether she had missed some sign. She searched for an explanation large enough to make the entire story feel coherent. But the more she searched, the more possibilities appeared. Sometimes she believed the cause was herself. Sometimes she thought it was the other person. Sometimes she believed it was timing. Sometimes she thought it was fate. Years later, Laura said that what kept her trapped for so long was not the breakup itself, but her inability to accept that there might never be a final answer perfect enough to explain everything. That is also one of the least discussed habits of the human mind. We often think we are searching for truth, but sometimes what we are really searching for is the comfort that comes from having an answer to hold on to. Imagine someone standing before a massive painting while only being allowed to see a tiny corner of it. He constantly tries to guess the entire image based on that small visible section. Each time he forms a theory, he feels slightly more at ease because at least he has a temporary explanation. But then a new detail appears and causes the entire theory to collapse, forcing him to begin constructing another explanation from the beginning. Sometimes people treat life in much the same way, constantly trying to complete the picture before they possess enough information to actually see the whole thing. Interestingly, modern neuroscience has also observed this tendency. The human brain is designed to reduce uncertainty, so when faced with incomplete information, it naturally constructs explanatory models in order to create a greater sense of stability and predictability about the world. This helps people survive more effectively in many situations, but it also makes it difficult for us to remain with experiences that have not yet reached a clear conclusion. That is why so many people spend years trying to find the ultimate meaning behind everything. They want to know exactly why they met this person instead of another. They want to know why an opportunity appeared and then vanished. They want to know why certain periods of life became chaotic, and they want to know where all suffering will eventually lead. But perhaps one of the most difficult realities of maturity is realizing that life does not always provide answers according to the timetable of the mind. Some doors are understood only long after we have walked through them. Some experiences reveal their meaning only after they have ended. And some things may remain with a person for an entire lifetime without ever being fully explainable through language. And from this perspective, act as if nothing matters is not an invitation to see life as meaningless, but an invitation to live as though we do not need to force every experience to immediately become a complete lesson, a clear message, or a final answer. Try allowing some questions to exist without answers. Try allowing certain chapters of life to close without fully understanding why they were ever opened. And try accepting that some things simply require far more time than the mind would like before revealing their meaning. Perhaps the greatest paradox is that when people stop forcing life to constantly explain itself, they begin to participate in life more fully instead of standing at the sidelines demanding explanations. And sometimes peace does not arrive at the moment we finally discover all the meaning we have been searching for. Instead, it arrives when we no longer need to know the meaning of everything immediately in order to continue walking our path. After all, life never promised that every question would be answered the moment it appeared. But perhaps it has always offered human beings another possibility: the ability to keep living, keep growing, and keep moving forward, even when part of the picture still remains beyond their sight. Number 9. What happens when the ego stops trying to win every battle? If people can learn to live with unanswered questions without feeling compelled to find the ultimate meaning behind everything, then perhaps an even deeper shift awaits them. What happens when the ego finally grows tired of the endless battle to prove that it must be more right, wiser, or stronger in every situation life presents? Carl Jung observed that the ego is rarely satisfied with simply existing. It always wants to compare, to distinguish, to establish its position, and to continually defend the feeling that it stands on the winning side. What is remarkable is that these battles do not always take place externally. In fact, most of them happen in silence. A conversation ended hours ago, yet the mind continues replaying it to prove that it should have said something sharper. A small argument ended long ago, yet internally new arguments continue being constructed to prove that one was right. A careless comment from someone can remain in the mind for days simply because the ego cannot accept being misunderstood. What is worth noticing is that many such battles never truly exist in objective reality. They continue to exist only within the mind of the person carrying them. That is why one of the greatest drains on human energy is not the challenges coming from the outside world, but the number of invisible battles the ego continuously launches within itself. There was a man named David who did not speak to his younger brother for nearly 12 years. Everything began with an argument after their father's funeral. At first, it was only a minor disagreement about how to handle certain family matters. No one could later remember exactly who raised their voice first, nor could anyone clearly recall which words caused things to become tense. The only thing that remained was the feeling of having been treated unfairly. In the days that followed, both men waited for the other to make contact first. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Throughout all that time, David told the story in the same way. He believed he was right, and believed that if his brother would simply admit his mistake, everything could have been resolved long ago. What was strange was that, over time, the original argument gradually stopped being important. It was no longer about what had happened that day. It became only about who would surrender first. In the 12th year, when their mother was hospitalized with a serious illness, the two brothers found themselves in the same room for the first time. David later said that the most shocking thing when he saw his brother sitting at the end of the hospital hallway was not the memory of the argument years before, but the realization that he could barely remember exactly what he had been fighting over. 12 years had passed. Their father was gone. Both men had more gray hair. Life had changed in countless ways, yet the ego still clung to an old battle as though it were the most important thing in the world. And for the first time, David realized there was a more painful question than who was right, whether being right was truly worth 12 years of a life. That is a profound distinction. Some battles are guided by reality, but others are guided by the ego. And many times, what exhausts people is not defending truth, but continually defending the image the ego wants to maintain about itself. Carl Jung once wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." This statement is not only about inner harmony, but also points towards something deeper. Many prolonged conflicts do not exist because the issue is so significant, but because the ego does not know how to stop fighting. Modern neuroscience also offers an interesting perspective on this phenomenon. Studies show that when people feel that their opinions or self-image are being threatened, brain regions associated with defensive responses can become active in ways similar to when facing a physical threat. In other words, the brain sometimes reacts to being wrong, as though it were confronting actual danger. This helps explain why so many people experience prolonged tension, discomfort, or obsession over very small disagreements. But this also reveals another truth. Not every alarm signal reflects a real danger. Perhaps the ego is like a general who sees battlefields everywhere. It searches for things that must be defended, positions that must be held, and wars that must be won. Yet the problem is that when a general lives too long in war, he begins to forget how to live in peace. The lives of many people unfold in much the same way. They argue with the past. They argue with things others once said. They argue with things that should never have happened. They argue with present reality. And while life continues moving forward, they spend a large portion of their energy fighting things that no longer need to be fought. That is why, as people mature, they begin to realize a very strange truth. Not every battle that can be won is a battle worth entering. Sometimes wisdom is not found in producing another argument. Sometimes strength is not found in striking back. And sometimes the greatest victory appears the moment a person simply decides not to continue the battle. From this perspective, act as if nothing matters is not an attitude of indifference toward life, nor is it a rejection of what truly matters. Instead, it is the ability to live without seeing every disagreement, every collision, and every challenge to the ego as a battle that must be won. Imagine the feeling of a person who no longer stays awake for hours trying to prove they were right. Imagine the relief that appears when an argument ends and the mind genuinely allows it to end as well. Imagine the space that opens when people no longer feel compelled to defend every opinion, every viewpoint, and every image they have built about themselves. Because perhaps what exhausts human beings most has never been life itself, but the number of battles the ego continuously creates and then demands that we carry. And sometimes the freest moment is not when we finally win all those battles, but when we realize that many of them never needed to begin. Number 10. The more mature people become, the less they react to life. When people gradually realize that not every battle is worth entering, an even deeper transformation begins to emerge. They no longer feel the need to react to everything that happens in life the moment it appears. There is something fascinating that often becomes visible when observing people who are truly psychologically mature. At first glance, many assume they have become colder, less caring, or less emotional. But if one looks more closely, something entirely different is taking place. They still see what others see, still hear what others hear, and still face circumstances similar to everyone around them. Yet between the event and the reaction, a new space seems to have appeared. That space makes all the difference. When young, many people live like a lake, constantly disturbed by every wind that passes across its surface. A compliment lifts them up. A criticism brings them down. A rejection occupies their thoughts for days. A small change in circumstances is enough to drag their entire inner state along with it. The external world becomes the person holding the remote control, while their inner condition continuously changes according to whichever button life happens to press. But over time, some people begin to realize something very strange. They cannot control what appears before them, but they do not necessarily have to become an extension of everything that appears. Carl Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." What is interesting in this statement is not the other people, but the word irritates. Jung was not speaking about events themselves. He was speaking about the reaction that arises within us when those events occur. Because many times what controls a person's life is not the external event, but the speed with which they become swept away by their own reaction. Perhaps that is why, as people mature, they become less likely to react impulsively to life. Not because they have lost their inner vitality, but because they begin to realize that not every stimulus requires an immediate response. A fascinating example of this can be seen in the life of Nelson Mandela. During the 27 years he spent in prison, he had countless reasons to nurture bitterness toward those who had taken away his freedom. If he had reacted in the ordinary way, he might have spent the rest of his life living alongside that resentment. But what made Mandela extraordinary was not what happened to him, but the fact that he did not allow everything that happened to determine his entire response. After being released, he once said that if he walked out of the prison gates carrying resentment, he would still be imprisoned. That does not mean he forgot what happened. It simply shows that between the event and the reaction, he created enough distance not to be dragged along by every stimulus emerging from the past. Modern neuroscience also reveals something remarkably similar. Research on executive brain functions shows that when people react immediately to a stimulus, the fast processing systems associated with survival tend to become more active. By contrast, when a brief pause appears before action, brain regions associated with evaluation, regulation, and choice become more involved in processing information. In other words, the difference between a reaction and a response often does not lie in what is happening. It lies in whether a person possesses enough inner space to choose how they wish to appear before what is happening. Everyday life provides countless small examples of this. A person receives an upsetting email at the end of the workday. In the past, they might have immediately replied while tense and then spent hours dealing with the consequences. But after years of experience, they begin closing the computer, taking a walk, and reading the email again the next day. A person is misunderstood during a conversation. In the past, they might have instantly argued to clarify everything, but eventually, they realize that not every misunderstanding needs to be resolved the very moment it appears. A person faces criticism. Previously, their entire mind might have become absorbed in self-defense. But over time, they learn to remain with what they have just heard for a little longer before deciding what they want to do with it. A person faces criticism. Previously, their entire mind might have become absorbed in self-defense. But over time, they learn to remain with what they have heard a little longer, to observe the feelings arising within them a little longer, before deciding what they want to do with it. These changes sound very small. Yet sometimes, all psychological maturity is built from precisely these small spaces, from those moments when people stop reacting through habit and begin living through more conscious choices. There is a beautiful image that illustrates this. Imagine a person standing by the sea. When they are immature, they are like a paper boat floating on the water. Every wave that passes instantly changes its direction. But over time, that paper boat gradually becomes a much larger ship. The waves are still there, the wind is still there, the sea is still there. The difference is that they no longer possess enough force to redirect the entire vessel every time they appear. Perhaps human inner life functions in much the same way. Life does not necessarily become easier. Stimuli continue to appear. Events continue to happen. Praise, criticism, loss, and surprise still exist. But people are no longer swept away by all these things in the same way as before. What is remarkable is that this process does not make life less rich. On the contrary, it often makes people more present with what is happening. Because when they are no longer dragged along by every stimulus, they begin seeing events more clearly instead of only seeing their reactions to those events. They begin seeing reality itself instead of only the emotional waves constantly moving within them. And here, once again, act as if nothing matters opens another layer of meaning. Not living as though everything is meaningless, nor living as though life can no longer affect us, but living as though not everything that appears deserves immediate control over our inner state. Because perhaps one of the deepest signs of maturity is not becoming stronger than the world, but no longer being carried away by everything the world continually throws in our direction. And perhaps it is within that quiet space between stimulus and response that a very different kind of freedom begins to emerge. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful enough to transform the entire way a person moves through life. And what is most remarkable about this transformation is that it rarely appears in life's grand moments. Most of the time, people do not realize they are maturing while standing before life-changing decisions. Instead, they recognize it in ordinary situations, in everyday moments where they once reacted almost automatically, only to suddenly realize one day that a new silence has appeared between what happened and the way they respond to it. If by this point you realize that what you feared most was never the darkness within, but the act of facing it, leave one word in the comments: courage. Perhaps that is also the moment you begin looking at yourself through different eyes. And perhaps, when you read the stories shared below, you will realize that you were never the only one walking through this journey. Number 11. Real life story. The woman who stopped responding immediately. I once heard the story of a woman named Hannah, and perhaps it is one of the clearest examples of this kind of quiet maturity. Hannah had a 16-year-old daughter named Olivia. For many years, she believed she was a devoted mother. She cared about every meal, every school day, every friendship, and nearly every small emotional change her daughter experienced. If Olivia was sad, Hannah immediately tried to make her feel better. If Olivia faced difficulties, she quickly offered solutions. If Olivia made mistakes, she immediately tried to show her a better path. In Hannah's mind, this was love, responsibility, and what a good mother was supposed to do. From the outside, it was difficult to find anything worthy of criticism in the way she cared for her daughter. But one evening, after a very ordinary argument about schoolwork, Olivia suddenly burst into tears. In the middle of her emotions, she looked directly at her mother and said something that Hannah would remember for many years afterward. "You always think you know what's best for me. You've never really listened to me." The room immediately fell silent. Hannah later said that in that moment, it felt as though her entire body tightened. A wave of heat rushed from her chest to her throat, while dozens of reactions appeared in her mind at once. One part of her wanted to argue back immediately, wanted to tell her daughter about all the sacrifices she had made, wanted to remind her of the sleepless nights, the worries, and the years spent caring for and protecting her. She wanted to prove that the statement was unfair, wanted to say that Olivia did not understand how hard she had tried. After everything she had done, how could her daughter possibly say such a thing? But strangely enough, that time Hannah said nothing. Not because she was calmer than usual, and not because she agreed with what her daughter had just said. In fact, she had no idea how she should respond. The shock itself caused her to remain still for a few seconds longer than usual, and unexpectedly, those few seconds would become the thing that changed everything later. Olivia turned around, went to her room, and shut the door. Hannah remained sitting alone in the living room. She barely slept that night, but instead of continuously thinking about how her daughter had been wrong, as she had done so many times before, for the first time in many years, she became preoccupied with a different question. What would happen if I didn't react immediately this time? That question made her more uncomfortable than the argument itself, because up until then, whenever she felt hurt, Hannah always reacted very quickly. She reacted to explain herself, reacted to defend herself, reacted to fix the situation, and sometimes reacted simply to regain a sense of control. But this time, she decided to do nothing at all. The next day she still went to work, still cooked dinner, and still followed her normal routine. However, she did not bring up the argument again, did not ask her daughter to apologize, and did not try to prove that she was right. Then something very strange began to happen. When she was no longer busy reacting, Hannah started seeing things she had never noticed before. She remembered hundreds of conversations between herself and Olivia. She remembered the times Olivia had tried to tell a story, but she had interrupted to offer advice. She remembered the times her daughter only wanted to be heard, but she had rushed to fix the problem. She even remembered moments she had called love, while Olivia's experience of those moments may have been completely different. Carl Jung once said, "Thinking is difficult. That is why most people judge." Perhaps genuine thinking is always more difficult than reacting. Reactions arrive quickly, while observation requires people to remain with discomfort long enough to see what is truly happening. For many years, Hannah reacted so quickly to everything involving her daughter that she never had the opportunity to clearly see what was actually happening between them. Not because she lacked love, but because that love had quietly become mixed with fear. Fear that her daughter would make mistakes, fear that she would suffer, fear that she would choose the wrong path, fear that she herself had not done enough. Those fears caused her to continually step into her daughter's life through reactions she genuinely believed were necessary. 3 days after the argument, Olivia came downstairs on her own. She sat across from her mother in a long silence before softly saying, "I don't need you to solve everything for me. I just need you to listen." Years later, Hannah still said that it was one of the most important sentences she had ever heard in her life, because for the first time she realized that sometimes the strongest response is not arguing, not yelling, and not proving yourself right, but the ability to remain with discomfort long enough to understand what truly needs to be understood. That was also when she began to understand that maturity does not mean no longer having emotions or no longer being hurt. Maturity is the ability not to let the first emotion become the first action, because the first emotion often comes from old fears, old wounds, and patterns that have existed within us for a very long time, while the choice that comes afterward is what ultimately determines who we become. Many years later, when looking back on that period, Hannah said that what changed her life was not the argument with her daughter, but the few seconds of silence after hearing the words that hurt her most. Because those few seconds created the first space between stimulus and reaction. A very small space, so small that most people would never notice it, yet sometimes all psychological growth begins from spaces exactly that small. And perhaps that is also what happens when people truly mature. The world does not become gentler, other people do not become more perfect, and the things that irritate us continue to appear. But gradually, a new silence begins to form between what is happening outside and what is happening inside. It is within that silence that people stop living as a continuous reaction to life and begin living as individuals capable of choice. Perhaps that is why the more mature people become, the less they react to life. Not because they no longer care, but because they have learned that not everything that appears needs to be answered immediately, and that sometimes the wisest thing is not to react faster, but to be still enough to see what truly needs to be understood. Number 12. What people truly fear is not loss, but impermanence. But if maturity teaches people not to react immediately to everything that appears, then what happens when they begin realizing that the very things they have always tried to hold on to may never have been meant to remain forever? There is a very particular fear that exists behind much of human anxiety, yet it is rarely called by its true name. People often believe they are afraid of losing a relationship, losing an opportunity, losing their current position, or facing unexpected changes in life. But if we look more closely, there seems to be something much deeper beneath all these fears. What people truly fear is not loss itself, but the realization that everything is changing, even when they do not want it to. Youth changes, relationships change, dreams change, careers change. Even the things that once convinced us we knew exactly who we were change over time. What is strange is that most suffering does not arise when change begins to happen. It arises when people try to keep everything in its old place longer than it can naturally remain there. Carl Jung once wrote, "Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. The version that existed at 20 cannot remain unchanged at 40. The things that were true during one stage may no longer be true in the next. Yet the ego often wants to freeze everything at the point where it felt safest. Perhaps that is why many people do not truly suffer, because life changes. They suffer because they discover they cannot prevent life from changing." A story that closely reflects this can be seen in the life of Oprah Winfrey. When the Oprah Winfrey Show became one of the most successful television programs in American history, it was more than just a job. It became a major part of her identity. For years, millions of people were familiar with Oprah appearing on their screens every day, and she herself admitted that the show felt like a part of her life. Yet eventually, she chose to end the show even while it remained successful. It was a decision that surprised many people. From the outside, Everything seemed to be functioning perfectly. Success was still there. The audience was still there. The status was still there. But Oprah understood something that many people prefer not to face. Just because something once fit does not mean it must exist forever. Later, she shared that one of the hardest parts was not letting go of the show itself, but accepting that an important chapter of her life had completed its role. What is worth noticing is that she did not lose the show because of failure. She was not forced to abandon it. What happened was simply the natural movement of life, and sometimes that kind of change creates even more anxiety than loss itself, because it offers no clear enemy to blame. It simply and quietly reminds us that everything is moving. Perhaps that is also what the mind finds so difficult to accept. We often believe that if we try hard enough, are careful enough, or wise enough, we can keep important things exactly where they are. But life seems to operate according to a different law. It never stops moving. A child grows up. A relationship matures. A career changes shape. A dream evolves into something else. Even the parts within ourselves never stop shifting. Imagine a person standing by the ocean, trying to hold onto a wave that has just reached the shore. He loves the beauty of that moment so much that he wants it to remain a little longer. But the harder he tries to hold it, the faster the water slips through his fingers. Not because he is doing something wrong, but because the nature of a wave is movement. Life is often the same. Much suffering appears when people try to turn things that were created to move into things that must remain still. Interestingly, modern psychology has observed the same phenomenon. Human beings possess a cognitive bias known as status quo bias, the tendency to prefer keeping things as they are because the brain often interprets familiarity as safer than change. Even when change has the potential to bring positive outcomes, the brain frequently responds with anxiety simply because it is moving beyond what is known. But life does not ask the brain for permission before continuing its movement. It keeps changing, keeps shifting, and keeps carrying everything through different seasons of its existence. Perhaps that is why one of the greatest paradoxes of maturity is that people gradually realize true security does not come from the ability to keep everything still, but from the ability to remain at peace while everything is changing. Because eventually people realize that what they are trying to preserve is not merely a job, a relationship, or a stage of life. What they are really trying to preserve is the sense of certainty those things once provided. Yet that certainty was never as permanent as they imagined. Jung spent many years studying the process of individuation, the journey through which people gradually become themselves. What is fascinating is that this journey does not occur by freezing oneself into a fixed shape. It unfolds through countless changes, countless departures from old versions of oneself, and countless entries into territories that once felt unfamiliar. In other words, life itself seems inseparable from movement. At this stage, act as if nothing matters does not mean living as though everything is meaningless. It does not mean living as though relationships, work, achievements, or the things we cherish no longer matter. Instead, it means trying to live as though nothing needs to remain forever in order to possess value. Love a moment while it is present. Appreciate a season while it is unfolding. Give yourself wholeheartedly to what life offers today, but at the same time, understand that the value of something does not depend on how long it lasts. Its value lies in the way it was present within your journey. Because what causes people the greatest pain has never been change itself. What causes pain is the prolonged battle against change. And perhaps one of the deepest forms of freedom emerges when people finally stop demanding that life remain still in order for them to feel safe. Then, within the constant movement of everything, they begin to realize something very strange. It is precisely because everything is impermanent that each present moment becomes so precious. And it is only when they stop gripping the flow of life that they can truly move with it for the first time, lightly and naturally. In your own life, what was once so important that you tried to hold on to it for a very long time, only to later realize that the attachment itself was what caused the greatest suffering? Share your story in the comments below. Perhaps your experience will help someone who is learning to let go realize that they are not alone on that journey. Number 13. Facing death makes many things suddenly seem small. But if people can finally stop trying to keep everything frozen in place in order to feel safe, then what happens when they confront an even more direct truth, a truth capable of rearranging nearly every priority in life within a single moment? In human psychological life, we often live as though we will always have plenty of time. There will always be time to repair a relationship, always time to say the things that need to be said, always time to pursue what we truly want to do, and always time to become the person we imagine we will someday become. This quiet assumption shapes the way most people organize their lives. They spend hours worrying about very small things, days carrying old arguments, and years trying to prove something to other people, or even to themselves. There are things that completely occupy their minds today, yet from a great enough distance, those things carry far less significance than they seem to. Carl Jung once wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." And one of the themes Jung repeatedly returned to during the later years of his life was the idea that an awareness of death has the power to restructure an entire system of values. Not because death brings pessimism, but because it forces people to look at life from an angle the ego rarely wishes to face. What is interesting is that when people believe they have unlimited time ahead of them, they often live as though everything is equally important. An unpleasant email can ruin an entire day. A careless remark can remain in the mind for weeks. A minor failure can become evidence that life is heading in the wrong direction. But when awareness of life's finiteness begins to appear more clearly, something very strange happens at the same time. Things that once seemed enormous suddenly become much smaller. An acquaintance of mine named Richard once shared his experience after receiving medical test results that led doctors to suspect he might have a serious illness. During the period of waiting for a final diagnosis, he said that within only a few short days, his entire way of looking at life changed in a remarkable way. The social media debates he had previously spent hours following suddenly seemed meaningless. People who had once irritated him no longer occupied his thoughts as much. Plans built mainly to impress others strangely lost their appeal. The only things left in his mind were his family, unfinished conversations, the people he loved, and the desire to fully live the days that were still present. Several weeks later, the results showed that his condition was not as serious as originally feared. Life gradually returned to normal, But Richard said one thing never returned to the way it had been before. He realized that during those days of confronting the possibility that his life was finite, he saw more clearly what truly mattered. What is worth reflecting upon is that almost nothing outside of him had changed significantly. The world remained the same. The people around him remained the same. The problems still existed. Yet what had changed was the measuring stick he used to evaluate all those things. This is also something that many modern psychological studies have observed. Within the field of existential psychology, terror management theory suggests that when people are reminded of life's finiteness, they often begin reassessing their priorities. Goals related to status, competition, and social image gradually lose importance, while values connected to personal meaning, human connection, and lived experience become more prominent than ever. In other words, awareness of death does not merely create fear, it also creates clarity. It is like a light suddenly switched on in a dark room of the mind, causing what truly matters to stand out more clearly, while things that were previously exaggerated begin returning to their actual size. Jung once wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." In many cases, only when people confront the deepest truths of life do they begin to recognize what they are truly living for, and what pursuits are merely things the ego has become accustomed to clinging to for a very long time. There is an image that always makes me think about this. Imagine a person climbing a very high mountain. While standing at the base, every stone on the path appears large. A branch blocking the way becomes something worth worrying about. A rough stretch of ground is enough to make the climber impatient. Yet when that person reaches the summit and looks down from a completely different altitude, everything that once occupied the entire field of vision suddenly becomes very small. Obstacles that once seemed enormous are barely noticeable within the vast landscape below. There are things that once kept us awake at night, yet years later we can barely remember why we worried so much. There are battles that once felt like matters of life and death, yet later become only tiny details within memory. There are concerns that once occupied our entire minds, yet from a greater distance, they no longer possess the power to determine the value of an entire life. Perhaps this is also the moment when people begin to understand that the value of something is not always proportional to the amount of attention they give it. Act as if nothing matters does not ask us to trivialize life. Instead, it raises a deeper question. If one day we look back upon the entire journey, will the things occupying our minds today still hold the same importance they do now? And from that question, many things begin to shrink on their own. Arguments, wounds, the need to compete, and the need to prove oneself gradually lose their authority, making room for a more mature understanding of what is truly worth carrying forward. Because ultimately, what changes a person's system of values is not the arrival of death itself, but the moment they genuinely allow its presence to remind them that time is finite. And when that happens, many things that once seemed enormous suddenly become small. Many burdens once carried for years no longer seem worth holding on to. And for the first time in a very long while, people can move forward more lightly, not because life has become simpler, but because they have finally seen clearly what is truly worth carrying on their journey. Number 14. Act as if nothing matters. is actually living from the self rather than the ego. If, after everything people have gone through on this journey, from no longer believing every story the mind tells them, no longer placing themselves at the center of the world, no longer identifying with social masks, no longer fearing the gaze of others, no longer clinging to a fixed identity, no longer running from their darker parts, no longer forcing life to constantly explain itself, no longer trying to win every battle, no longer reacting to every stimulus, no longer fearing change, and gradually learning to view everything from a perspective larger than themselves, then perhaps what waits at the end of the road is not a more perfect version of the ego, but the emergence of another center, one that is deeper, quieter, and far freer than the self we have always assumed ourselves to be. Perhaps this is also where the phrase, "act as if nothing matters," is most often misunderstood. When people hear it, they imagine indifference. They think it means no longer caring, no longer feeling, living coldly, or surrendering to whatever happens. But viewed through the lens of Carl Jung, its deepest meaning appears to lie somewhere entirely different. It is not about stopping love. It is not about abandoning meaningful things. It is not about becoming emotionally numb to life. It is about the moment people gradually stop handing over complete control of their lives to fear, to roles, to control, to the need for certainty, and to everything the ego constantly clings to in order to feel that it exists. Carl Jung once wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness." Perhaps the entire journey he called individuation ultimately leads back to this realization. Because in Jung's view, two very different centers exist within every human being. One is the ego, the self we have known since childhood, the part that constantly worries about its place in the world, wants recognition, wants approval, wants to know what the future holds, wants to avoid suffering, wants to control outcomes, and wants to protect the image it has built about itself. It continuously asks questions such as, "Who am I? What do other people think of me? Is this good or bad for me? Am I losing something important?" But deeper than the ego lies another center that Jung called the self. The self is not a larger ego, nor a more perfected version of the ego. It is more like the deepest center of the entire psychological life, where opposing parts within a person gradually become reconciled, where people no longer live primarily from the fears and desires of the ego, but begin living from a fuller sense of who they are. I once heard about a man named Thomas in an applied psychology program. For nearly 30 years, Thomas built almost his entire life around his career. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He constantly set new goals for himself, and every achievement he reached immediately became the starting point for the next objective. Colleagues admired him, his family was proud of him, and he himself believed this was the path he had been created to follow. Then one day, the company where he worked underwent restructuring. There was no great tragedy, no scandal, and no dramatic betrayal. It was simply that the position he had occupied for more than 2 decades no longer existed. Thomas said that for many months afterward, he felt as though a part of himself had been taken away. Every morning he woke up unsure of who he was without that job, without that position, and without the meetings that had once filled his life. What hurt him most was not losing the job itself, but the feeling that he was disappearing along with it. Yet it was during that period of instability that something very strange began to happen. For the first time in many years, he had time to sit quietly with himself, not with a role, a title, or the next goal to conquer, but simply with himself. At first, this felt deeply uncomfortable, but little by little, he began to recognize a very different truth. The person was still there even after the role had disappeared. His value had never truly been contained within the title he once held. What disappeared was only the image the ego had clung to for so long and mistaken for the entirety of who he was. And that was also the first time Thomas touched a kind of freedom he had never known before. There is a beautiful image for understanding this state. Imagine someone spending an entire lifetime clutching a raft while floating down a river. For many years, he believes the raft is the only thing keeping him alive, so he grips it tighter and tighter. He fears losing it, fears the current carrying it away, and fears anything that threatens his ownership of it. Then one day, when his arms have become too exhausted, he accidentally loosens his grip. And in that very moment, he discovers something he had never noticed before. The river itself has been holding him up all along. What keeps him afloat is not only the raft, but the water beneath it. Sometimes the ego is like that raft, while the self is like the river. We spend many years clinging to roles, identities, success, recognition, relationships, and familiar images of ourselves, believing they are the only things keeping us alive, until life gradually takes them away, not as punishment, but to reveal that beneath all those things lies a foundation far deeper than we ever imagined. That is also why truly mature people often carry a very different presence. They still love, but no longer cling desperately. They still work wholeheartedly, but no longer identify their entire worth with results. They still pursue goals, but no longer see success as the sole proof of their existence. They still enter relationships, but no longer love from the fear of abandonment. And they still live within the world, but no longer allow the world to pull them in every direction as it once did. Externally, they may not appear very different from everyone else, but internally, the center from which they operate has changed. It is no longer the ego, it is the self. And perhaps this is where the entire journey converges. Because after all the previous chapters, what has been gradually dismantled was never merely a collection of separate fears. What has truly been dismantled is unconscious identification with the ego itself. When that happens, life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes lighter, and perhaps after all, the greatest freedom Carl Jung tried to point toward was never freedom from the external world, but freedom from the invisible domination of the ego within. When that happens, people do not become less feeling. On the contrary, for the first time they become capable of being fully present with life, because they are no longer living to protect a role. They begin living from the deepest person they have carried within them, from the beginning of the journey to its very end. When you look back over this entire journey, perhaps you will realize that act as if nothing matters was never a call to live with indifference toward life. On the contrary, it is an invitation to live more consciously within life. It is the ability to look at an event without immediately turning it into a tragedy. It is the ability to feel an emotion without allowing it to define who you are. It is the ability to move through change judgment, and uncertainty without seeing them as threats to your value. Perhaps true maturity is not about making life simpler. Perhaps it is about becoming larger inside than whatever life throws at us. And when that happens, a very different kind of relief begins to appear. Not because every problem disappears, but because those problems no longer hold absolute power over our minds. If this video touched something within you, share it with those who are carrying far more than they were ever meant to carry alone.